Good morning, everybody. So I think we'll just kick off, if that's all right. We're going to start with just getting everybody onto Slido. Slido is the tool that we use to manage the questions and also to allow people to participate in the polls. So we've now got a number of people on the line. So I can just ask you to take out your iPad or your smartphone or go to a different page on your browser and just put in the word slido.com. And you will find there's a window that appears where it says enter the event code. And if you just put in M&A, as we've got here written in red, M&A, into that event code and click join an existing event, you will end up with a page which hopefully looks very much like this. And this allows you to basically ask questions of our panelists. So literally type your question in here and then click ask. It allows you to participate in the polls. And also, more importantly, it allows you to upvote the questions you'd like the panelists to address later on. So we are going to switch to the poll which we're running to see how we're doing in terms of people logging in. And you can see 26 people have managed to log in here. So the poll is basically saying, when will we see deal volume return? Is it going to be in September? Is it too early to tell? Or do we think it's going to be next spring? In other words, the level of uncertainty at the moment means that the M&A activity isn't going to pick up quite yet. So we'll let that run in the background, and we can come back to that at the end as well to see how we've been doing. So just to set the scene, the webinar today is about M&A and investing during COVID. And the reality is that despite the fact that the pandemic has brought the broader economy to a halt, healthcare as a sector has been affected relatively less. And more importantly, we've also seen a number of transactions. So quite early on, we saw Nordic Capital acquire Spa Medica, which is an ophthalmic clinical business for around £300 million. There's in fact other assets in the market at the moment that are also seeing attention from similar buyers. Independent Clinical Services, which is a big healthcare staffing business, was acquired by Onyx, and Towerbrook reinvested in that deal in April. Fisherwack, which is a pharma services business, was also acquired in April by Bridgepoint from LDC for £240 million. And most recently on Monday, Rosemont Pharmaceuticals, which is a specials business, was acquired by Inflexion. I'm delighted that Ben Long is on the panel today, given that this is a transaction which really has happened in the middle of the pandemic. If I look around more broadly though, there have been other deals out there. Livingston Capital bought Patricia White, which was a home care business that was bought out of Saga. Linnaeus, the veterinary chain that Sovereign used to own, sold to Mars, bought the Animal Ark Veterinary Centre. Ancala Partners bought Homely Care Homes. And Medique, which is a pharma distribution business owned by Advent, bought H&R Healthcare in the UK. So whilst everyone may assume the world has come to a grinding halt, the reality is that actually there has been activity, albeit perhaps in certain sectors. Now, we asked the attendees to submit some questions when they registered, and I thought it'd be useful just to put up the sorts of questions that people are focused on. You can see that it's very much around M&A and valuations, unsurprisingly. Could COVID spur consolidation in some of these sectors? Do you think valuations have permanently changed as a result of COVID? What's the outlook for valuations and not just for care, but also for healthcare companies? How are new businesses getting finance in this market? One question was around emerging markets, whether there's appetite to look outside the UK. I think an interesting one is the impact of COVID on red book valuations, particularly for real estate backed businesses. actually understanding how you do a valuation when you can't actually do a site visit is pretty important. So I think, the way one does a site visit, can you do it virtually? Can you use a drone? Can you rely on previous valuations? How do you get your M&A process to work with that challenge? And then a question around whether sale and leaseback is going to see a comeback in the market. Secondly, around lending, which is particularly relevant to having Derek from Clydesdale on. What is the bank appetite for CBILs? Are the banks really open for business, or are they just saying they're open? And which segments of the market do you think are going to be active over the next 12 to 18 months from a lending perspective? And then the bigger question, which is, what is the outlook for COVID-19, and what are the positive things that have come out of what we've seen so far? So I think some good questions there, and the panelists are going to address them during their presentations. And we've got a great lineup today. So we've got two investors, Sam Gray, who's the managing partner at Apposite Capital, and Ben Long, who's a partner at Inflexion, who, as I said, just made that Rosemont acquisition. And they've both got very, very different portfolios, which I think is good, because that gives you a very broad exposure as to where people are investing in healthcare at the moment. We then got Izzy Corbett, who's the head of healthcare M&A at PwC, and David Jones, who's the partner at Deloitte, who runs their healthcare team. And both of them really see a huge volume of transactions in the market. So I think are in a pretty unique position, actually, to see where the flow is, where the demand is, what people are doing, how they're running processes, what's going on with the timing. And then Derek from Clydesdale and Yorkshire Bank. Clydesdale and Yorkshire Bank have been really building their business over the last few years. And this is now a bank with a nearly £1 billion portfolio of book lending into healthcare. And as other banks are retreating from the market, they're really filling a void. So again, I think it'd be very interesting to hear from Derek where he's seeing the lending going as well. So on that, I am going to hand over to Sam, first of all, to tell us a little bit about Apposite Capital, how their portfolio companies have been dealing with COVID, and I think more interestingly for this, what is the outlook now, both for those portfolio companies and also the investment opportunities. So Sam, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me or don't know Apposite Capital, I'm the managing partner at Apposite, and I've been working at Apposite since 2007. And Apposite, in fact, has been operating in the healthcare market and investing since that time. So we are one of the longest established specialist healthcare private equity investment groups. I think we're probably now one of the largest teams that are focusing at that lower end of the market exclusively on healthcare. We have 10 people in the Apposite Capital team, all of whom are absolutely committed and wedded to looking at smaller businesses in the healthcare sector, typically with an enterprise value of up to 50 million euros or pounds. We really do consider ourselves to be sector specialists and immersed in the sector. What we're trying to do is to identify businesses that will be champions in their niche, businesses that can be best in class in some aspect of what they do, and to then work with those businesses and the management teams of those businesses to grow them to a point where they're going to be highly attractive at exit. And in the history of Apposite, we've had 17 exits over the 14 years we've been operating. We've had a very, very strong track record and investment performance. And I think one of the reasons we're able to achieve that is because we are so immersed in the sector and understanding the drivers that move the sector forward. So Henry's moving me on. My next slide is an overview of our portfolio as it stands today. And what you'll see here is that we are quite diversified across different areas of healthcare. And that's always been very deliberate. We consider that, whilst healthcare is a single sector, it is also a very, very large and broad sector. And we will benefit by being diversified across different areas within it. And I think we have really seen that during this COVID period, where the effects of the crisis on different businesses have been, ranging from positive to negative, and some businesses hardly affected at all. So obviously in businesses such as our genetics business, NIM Genetics, where they are able to sell a COVID test, they've had some of their best months ever in terms of revenue and trading. We have anti-infection products within the Summit Medical portfolio. Those products have done well. But at the same time, we have businesses that are doing medical imaging procedures or dentistry procedures, which are just not possible or at a much reduced level during lockdown. So we've really seen from a portfolio perspective the benefits of being diversified, also being diversified across payers, because governments have continued to be very good payers by and large across the portfolio. Some of the more discretionary private self-pay activity has been the sort of revenue streams more affected by lockdown. So the net result though has been a very strong performance, and I think bodes well for the healthcare sector in the future. And I think from an investor point of view, we're seeing ever more interest from our own investors in investing in healthcare, because it is one of the more resilient sectors, and I think there will be a huge amount of opportunity and indeed a requirement for investment in healthcare as we come out of this COVID period. So I guess one of the questions we've asked ourselves is how should we vary our investment thesis? How should we change what we're doing, looking at the new world, the new normal? And one of the things that we have always sort of used as our prime value creation thesis is the sort of concepts of value creation through improving healthcare, patient outcomes, and cost efficiency or health economics. And we've always believed that businesses that can evidence and demonstrate they're improving patient outcomes, delivering quality healthcare services, and doing so with good health economics, better cost efficiencies, serving their payers and commissioners with better value, will be the businesses that are successful. And they're also the businesses that are solving that huge problem within healthcare, which is the demand and supply imbalance caused by the aging population. So we've always focused our investment theses on businesses that solve that demand supply imbalance, improves the efficiency of the healthcare system. And post-COVID, that demand supply imbalance is now absolutely pivotal and key to emerging to a more normal state. We have a massive increase in demand. We have a reduction in capacity across most of the healthcare system, caused by COVID and caused by workforce and caused by infection control measures that have to be put in place. So that demand supply imbalance that we've always sought to address is accentuated, I don't know, 1,000, 10,000 fold, who knows, but it's a really key problem. And I think investing in the sorts of businesses and business models that we always have invested in is becoming even more critical. And in fact, some of the themes that we've been pursuing over the years have become really accelerated, and digitalization is a fantastic example of that. Maybe we'll talk about a little bit later as a panel. But I think that area is going to see a lot of growth within healthcare going forward. So drilling down just a little bit, I've stolen some material from a competitor of some of my esteemed colleagues on the panel. I've also sort of tweaked it a little bit so they can't be fully blamed for this slide. But I've tried to show that healthcare isn't a homogeneous sector that's positive or negative. It is made up obviously of lots of different areas and subsectors. I think we also need to be very, very careful when we're thinking about the impact of COVID on the healthcare sector to say over what time period, because the short-term impact on businesses that were effectively shut down during the lockdown is one thing, but in the longer term and even in the medium term, there may be a lot of demand or pent-up demand or ability to solve some of the fundamental sector issues So I'm thinking here of things like our imaging centres. In the short term, they were obviously heavily impacted by lockdown, but coming out of COVID, there's a huge amount of backlog for elective surgeries, for imaging procedures. There's also a strong desire to keep people out of hospital settings where possible. So I think those sorts of businesses will benefit actually, but obviously it's a medium to long-term benefit rather than an immediate benefit. Whereas some of the sort of diagnostics type companies, PPE manufacturers, perhaps UK-based or more national-based smaller businesses will be benefiting immediately. So this is a summary of a rough view of where healthcare is benefiting or not. I'm sure there will be discussion and debate about many of these, but it helps to set the scene, I think.
So, Sam, thank you very much for that. I think just to sort of to paraphrase a little bit of what you were saying, the portfolio you've got's really benefited from being diversified, and there have been winners and losers. And I think you identified a genetic testing business that's been a clear winner out of this. But perhaps maybe looking forward, the key for investors is to look at that supply-demand imbalance and acknowledge that will actually be changed by what's happened during this pandemic. And perhaps as a result of that, there are new opportunities that people would not have looked at before. Whilst the sort of the fundamental thesis that you want to invest in businesses that improve healthcare delivery, where that supply-demand imbalance may have shifted, and there may be opportunities that are also driven by technology, digital, as you mentioned. So I think that sort of summarizes it very, very nicely. I'm now going to move on to Ben. And again, Ben's portfolio at Inflexion has a different complexion, is still very diversified. But I think it'd be very good just to get his perspective as well, and see if we can draw out any other themes for the audience.
Sure. Thanks, Henry, and thanks, Sam. I always dread following in Sam's footsteps because, as he says, they're properly deep in the healthcare sector. We're trying to be, but we can't match 13 years of consistent focus in that part of the market. Briefly on Inflexion, we're a mid-market private equity house, been around for about 20 years. We currently have £5.5 billion under management. About 3 billion of that is currently available to invest. And we invest in a range of sectors, but the unifying theme is basically growth, and we try and accelerate that growth by providing capital, also providing a bit more operational expertise in terms of a digital and technology team that we have in-house. We have offices in the US, Brazil, China, India, and all of that is basically there for our portfolio companies to use to expand. Should we whip on, Henry? Because people don't want to hear too much about Inflexion, I'm sure. So this is our current portfolio. We have what I would say were sort of two product businesses, basically. LaingBuisson, which is the market leader in the UK for osteoarthritis in dogs in particular, and Rosemont, which, as Henry said, we acquired the other day, and it's probably the largest specialist liquid pharmaceutical business in the world. It's a really incredible example of actually what you find in the UK healthcare space, a sort of business that's quietly getting on with doing something that's incredibly high value add, and is actually a global leader in what it does. Rosemont has 180 products, 130 of them are licensed pharmaceuticals in the UK. Some of them are directly sort of relevant right now. So we make liquid paracetamol, and we make dexamethasone, which hit the newspapers last week. But the majority of it is just taking advantage of the same long-term trends that Henry and Sam have covered. We then have two services businesses, European Life Care, which is Europe's largest chain of vaccination clinics. We were doing a lot of travel vaccinations. We're not doing so many of those anymore, although Denmark's reopened up, and that's the largest part of our business at the moment. We are doing a hell of a lot of flu and pneumonia vaccinations. And whilst I don't personally think the chances of a COVID-19 or a coronavirus vaccination coming to market anytime soon. I don't personally think the chances are very high. I think the level of awareness of disease and the impact that that the pandemic has had on people's perceptions should only be positive for us in the medium to long term. And then we have two data businesses, Kinetic, which provides data to the animal health industry, and Pharma Spectra, which provides data on key opinion leaders to big pharma and biotechs. Should we whip on, Henry? It's just, I mean, I don't think I'm going to say anything earth-shattering on this slide. A lot of it Sam has picked up. There have been some areas that have clearly been quite heavily disrupted by the pandemic. And I think there's an ongoing question about what the recovery curve will look like, which sectors will come back now, which will come back on the more medium to long-term basis. I think we're still finding that out at the moment. And the other major disruption from a private equity perspective has been primarily, I think, around the credit markets. My personal perspective has been that is perhaps been undue. We raised a fairly healthy level of debt as part of our funding for Rosemont the other day. We're working on something else which is smaller right now, but again, very strong appetite for the sector from, in particular, the credit funds. I think at the end of the day, you know, the finance industry wants to keep moving and wants to keep doing deals, and if anything, there's probably going to be more demand for healthcare from the credit side. I think in the medium to long term, the pandemic is probably only going to be a good thing for the sector. I think it's really demonstrated its strength. It's demonstrated the value it contributes to society across the world, and it's also demonstrated its attractions to investors. I think in the short term, having the sort of deep sector networks that we've tried to build, and which Sam has, will be critical. There are some sort of deal mechanics in the short term around, you know, how do you get to know a management team really well in the run up to a sale process when, you know, for the past few months, you've not really been able to meet people face to face. Understanding the sector in depth so you can understand those recovery curves, I think, is pretty important. So, for example, I know from one of the directors of one of the major hospital trusts in the UK that that they're expecting to be at probably 75% capacity by the autumn. So there will still be a fair amount of elective surgery that's not getting done, and that's before you enter any kind of seasonal demand spike. So those kind of deep sector networks, I think, will be really important in the short term. In the long term, as I say, I think it will be really positive for the sector. There will be an acceleration of the trends that Sam referred to earlier. On the services side, that will be around use of outpatient settings, moving patients out of the hospital, as Sam said, for scans, but also procedures. Greater use of remote monitoring, greater use of remote consultation, and on the pharma side, more kind of virtual trials and that sort of thing. I think the main, and you know, this is, I guess, a good thing for the sector, but a bad thing for an investor, is the main problem that I can see on the horizon is that I imagine there will be an influx of new investors in the market, both on the debt side and on the equity side, because people will have seen the impact of this crisis on other parts of the market, and they'll have probably thought to themselves, kind of, hang on a second, I sort of wish I had a bit more exposure to the healthcare space. And so I think the risk for us is there will be tons more buyers in the market going forward. So great news for Izzy, great news for David, great news for business owners, sort of terrible news for people like us who've got to put £3 billion to work in the next few years.
So I think, Ben, that's a very nice place to stop. I mean, I think that's a very good perspective. And just to, again, to try and summarize where we are, and if I look at Sam's portfolio, Apposite are active in diagnostics, and that's both IVD and imaging, but also in things like home care and dental. You're very much active in vets and vaccines and pharma services. So there's actually very limited overlap between the two. And I think what I'm hearing here is that there's plenty of opportunity out there. There may be more competition going forward as people realise that healthcare is an interesting sector. But actually, it'll be very good to hear from Derek in a moment with the sort of the Clydesdale Bank hat on, because I do think that the credit markets are really important here. Who is going to lend into this sector? What are they going to lend into? What are they going to be risk averse around? And one of the questions, if you look at where private equity is invested historically, is what's going to happen to that real estate backed part of the market, all those care homes, adult specialist care, even things like nurseries, where historically people deployed capital. Are there bargains to be had now, or actually is there a shift in terms of how one should look long term about where you invest in this sector? So on that, I think that's a very, very timely lead in to Izzy to give us really a perspective of someone who's been incredibly active on the M&A front and transacting a lot across lots of these different segments of the market, to give us a sense of where we are today. So Izzy, over to you.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Ben and Sam. So good morning. My name is Izzy Corbett. I run our healthcare M&A team at PwC. Our business is a European business, but based out of London. I've worked in the healthcare corporate finance space now for 15 years, coming up to 5 years at PwC, and previously a little over a decade at Rothschild. But in that time, only focusing on healthcare. I've been fortunate enough in that time period to have done roughly 75 completed transactions, both in the UK and continental Europe. And I think the continental European piece is always quite interesting when thinking about the UK and how at different rates of recovery or different clinical models. It's always quite nice to sort of have that interplay between your home domestic market and incremental market. We've done a mixture of sell-side, buy-side, refinancing, restructuring, and IPOs, but as I said, always in the healthcare sector. And since we started the business at PwC, we've completed a little over 20 transactions across a relatively broad transaction size, across a number of subsectors. But enough on us. Maybe we can move on to the next slide, please, Henry. So one of the things about healthcare is we've always talked about healthcare being a resilient sector, and to a large degree, I think this has really been panned out over the last sort of few weeks and months. If we look on the left-hand side, this shows the last 8 major market corrections, and here we've looked at the S&P 500, where the S&P 500 has the market's declined by over 15% on a TSR basis. And healthcare has performed pretty strongly through those market declines, far better than other staple sectors like energy, infrastructure, consumer, or industrials. I think this has been particularly marked through this pandemic. If we look on the right-hand side, as demonstrated by the share price performance, when compared to the highs prior to COVID back in February 2020. When we look at the listed European healthcare services sector, we look at a composite of companies. That composite has recovered pretty much to the pre-COVID highs by coming into the month of June, whereas actually the broader European indices and also the FTSE 100 are still 10 or 15% down from where they were pre-COVID. And I think the question comes as to what has really driven that outperformance, and I think it goes back to some of the things that both Sam and Ben spoke about, being one, the resilient characteristics of healthcare as an industry per se, but also those sort of longer term growth fundamentals which have certainly not gone away. Maybe if we just turn over the page, Henry. So although healthcare has performed comparatively strongly through the pandemic, the healthcare sector, as we know, is a pretty broad church and has not been entirely immune. On this slide, we've attempted to, and I hasten to add, we've done this illustratively. We've attempted to look at how certain subsectors have operated both through the pandemic, but also as we emerge out of the pandemic and the different trajectories that some of those subsectors might take. And we've depicted these sort of 4 likely sort of scenarios or trajectories. The first is the new normal, a terrible phrase I acknowledge and I do apologise for, but it's one that everyone seems to love. But the new normal, where demand has clearly surged during the lockdown, and the pandemic has almost acted as a catalyst for longer term trends to accelerate their growth. In this bucket, we'd include, anything where there's been substitution of physical interaction with a sort of more of a virtual care model. And examples we would sort of cite would be something like Dr. Lib, which is a French-based online booking and remote consultation platform. And there, at the beginning of March, they were doing roughly 1,000 video consultations. That grew to 100,000 video consultations by the beginning of May, which I think gives some sense as to the real acceleration within that industry. Equally, online pharmacies would be another good example where Pharmacy to You has materially increased its penetration really over the last 2 months, as people have had to rely upon digital services rather than going into sort of old-fashioned pharmacies. The second cohort, we've called it limited impact, but I would call it limited financial impact. And I stress the financial element because I would not want to downplay the huge amounts of operational and management time and effort that's been required to be able to keep these businesses going on a sound footing through COVID. In this bucket, we'd include some of the more essential sort of B2G funded services, so adult specialist care, learning disabilities, ABI, mental health, children's services, being specialist education, children's homes, fostering, but also home care, both on the private and public side, where we see that sort of recovery phase maybe taking a little bit of share from more traditional institutional settings. The third bucket we've called the rebound bucket, where there were services which were clearly impacted by lockdown in terms of not being able to operate or not being able to operate at full capacity, but which we see rebounding to previous levels pretty quickly post the end of the lockdown. Here we've included vets. The old adage that in the UK we prefer to look after our pets and our children sometimes, I think is certainly has some resonance. IVF, where the time critical nature of the service has really driven an uptick since those clinics have reopened. But also dentistry, funnily enough, which I think has suffered in the UK more than some of its northern European peers by a bit of confusion over government policy. But I think we see that rebounding relatively quickly once the lockdown ends. And then the fourth category we've called gradual recovery. And this bucket, we're thinking of sectors where the long-term fundamentals are still extremely positive, but the short-term contraction through COVID might take a little bit longer to unwind. Here we've included elderly care homes, where rebuilding the occupancy from levels where they are today, will take a little bit of time. We've included aesthetics or more business consumer focused healthcare businesses, which their recovery curve might be impacted by the likely consumer recession that we're going to go through. And then finally, we've included electives, which might be it's a bit of a trickier one to diagnose, sort of pun intended, in the sense that there are inescapably huge waiting lists and huge pressure being placed upon health institutions. But we just think the unpicking and unwinding of the barriers that were created through the pandemic crisis might just take a little bit of time to unwind, in truth. I hasten to add a slightly illustrative overview of how we see some of the subsectors rebounding post-COVID.
Izzy, thank you very much. I actually think that chart's very useful just to sort of put a perspective on these different subsectors and how they may or may not perform. And if anything, I think we've learned out of this pandemic that the unexpected happens. If you were an infrastructure investor and you'd invested in an airport, you probably felt that there was structural demand for increased air traffic stretching out into the middle distance. Today, if I take AMP, for example, who invest in Care Management Group and Regard, suddenly the people who led that healthcare investment look as if they've invested in something that really has resilience, that is social infrastructure. And the people who've invested in their airport infrastructure, and there's a lot more Australian dollars invested in airports than are in healthcare, suddenly don't look so good. So in your previous slide where you showed that utilities have tended to perform very well during market movements and large negative movements, this is a change this time. So it really is different. And I guess, we'll come on to the Q&A, but what people are going to want to know is limited impact and new normal. Is that where we're seeing the deal flow? Are there going to be a lot of children's services and adult specialist care businesses coming to the market? Will we see the vets, the IVF providers, the dental groups come back maybe spring next year when they bounce back? And on the gradual recovery bucket, maybe that's something that does take longer to come back to market, or maybe there are some bargains to be had there. I think that's a very helpful summary. So on that, I'm now going to turn over to David Jones. And David, I'm delighted that you have been able to join us as well. David has also been very active as an M&A advisor over the years, but actually started in the sector many years ago with Westminster Healthcare. So actually comes from the perspective of an operator as well many, many years ago. So David, over to you.
Thank you, Henry. Just to introduce myself, David Jones. I'm a partner at Deloitte, similar to Izzy, cover healthcare and healthcare across Europe. Very, I guess, pleased to be in healthcare. It's been relatively recession-proof over the many decades. Deloitte, a global business doing deals across many, many countries. That gives us huge insight into, cannabis deals in Canada, right through to medtech deals in Israel, and the ability to take that learning and bring it to the UK market is really, really helpful. Very large number of people involved in all aspects of healthcare, right through from services to biotech. And Henry, a plug for you there, the LaingBuisson Awards. So thank you for that last year. So moving on. So it's hard to say something new which hasn't been said by Sam, Ben, and Izzy. But just to pick up a couple of the key themes there. The debt market has come back, although pricing is still a little bit off on where it was pre-COVID, but leverage levels for good businesses are back, and Ben made that point. Covenants are slightly tighter, but again, we expect those to ease as the banking market basically opens up to sectors which are strong, and healthcare is viewed as a very strong sector. In terms of the equity markets, healthcare has outperformed many other sectors, which is not surprising. So the funds that are seeking to invest and deploy are looking at healthcare. Now that's great for advisors, it's great for sellers. It means that there's a lot more funds chasing too few deals. In terms of M&A volume, obviously COVID has put a stop to M&A in most of the healthcare services transactions, but in terms of pharmaceuticals, life sciences, those deals have continued, and I'm sure we'll touch on that in the panel session, because it is difficult to do deals through the COVID period. But the point, pre-COVID, there was a wall of money sitting with private equity funds awaiting deployment. That has basically not been deployed through the COVID period. So the number of PE funds that are seeking to find good opportunities in the market has just increased. And the challenge is many sectors are off limits now. So consumer, leisure, retail, they're hard sectors to deploy cash into. So again, more of a focus back into health and pharma. And health and pharmaceuticals have been very much put on the agenda by COVID. So, Colonel Tom, clap for carers, the announcements by government around investment into the sector, the whole COVID-19, really profiling care homes and the issues in social care, which is good for the sector. I hope that government now takes some action on the back of this. But also the corporates. I mean, we've seen Ramsay during the period raise funds. So I expect to see some of the large corporates actually who haven't been massively impacted by COVID seek to deploy funds and consolidate in the market, or consolidate globally probably. And again, as mentioned previously, the infra funds, which started to look at healthcare prior to COVID, whether it be AMP or Anton or Icon, now a lot more infrastructure funds will, can't invest in toll roads, can't invest in airports, would probably seek to look at social care and healthcare generally as a stable cash flow business. That's moving on, Henry. So rather than repeat what Izzy said, and I absolutely agree with the areas that he outlined on the speed of recovery, trying to think forward about the impact of COVID and what that will do to the healthcare market moving forward. We definitely will see different ways of working. We're all doing this over Zoom. We will see healthcare in other parts of the market start to use technology a lot more. So the adoption of digital, remote solutions. So I hope that we see funding put behind these, but the development of telecare, remote monitoring. We've mentioned businesses like Pharmacy to You, so online pharmacy, remote GP consultations. I just see a lot more of that coming. It will take time. Many of these businesses are small and nascent, but I think we're all a lot more used to receiving services, whether it be teleconferencing or anything, now remotely and into our own home. And that brings me on to the second point, which is really alternative healthcare settings. We don't need to have the number of consultations in hospitals or overnight stays in hospitals that we have got used to. That's the way the funding flows in the UK. I hope, again, that funding flows start to change and we see the evolution of a lot more treatment for people at home, whether that's complex home care, whether it's general home care, but also, different types of care settings. We have care homes in the UK and we have at home, but we have very little of the development of the assisted living model, retirement village. So if we start to become a little bit reluctant about the use of care homes longer term, will we find the evolution of different types of care through assisted living, etc., as I said. One thing I think which COVID has accelerated is the thinking around the efficiency of our healthcare system. We moved very quickly through the pandemic to discharge people from hospital, in some cases not in the right way, where we had the infection, COVID-19 infection rates. But can we move to better discharging, a better joined up system between health and social care, and also driving efficiencies, the use of teleradiology, which again is remote provision of teleradiology into hospitals rather than having those radiologists sit in the hospital reading scans. Different types of staffing solutions. So you've got companies like Medinet, 18-week, all providing staff into hospitals to deal with backlogs. So I think that changing of the way we do business in our acute hospitals will be accelerated. All of these trends were there before COVID. I think COVID will just drive an acceleration of this. And then I think corporates will think in a different way about how they provide healthcare to their employees. So I see the evolution of a lot more around occupational health, screening services, and support to employees around GP and dental services. So maybe the evolution of more corporate wellness, corporate support to employees going forward. And then individuals themselves, people like myself, we've all become addicted to buying our healthcare online, whether that's DNA tests, whether it's vitamin supplements, and even mental health services. So again, I think individuals will take a lot more responsibility for healthcare moving forward. And I think that will drive the B2C model in healthcare. We all surf healthcare now. If there's something wrong with you, you tend to Google it before you go anywhere. So that will only continue. And then just coming off that supply chain, obviously we've all heard about PPE, the challenges around supply chain in the system as a result of COVID. I think that will change how, in particular, pharmaceuticals are sourced. We won't source from one country; we want dual sourcing. So I think we'll see evolution on supply chain and hopefully procurement as well within the NHS, where we need to move faster to procure services. And then the big point, which has been mentioned previously, data. We need more data, we need analytics. Everybody's been addicted to the amount of people suffering from COVID, how many positive tests, how many tests. The need for data has absolutely been emphasized by the pandemic. So hopefully, a change in the way we deliver healthcare for the good moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, David. I think just to pull three sort of themes out of there. There are potentially new buyers in town in terms of corporate buyers who've raised capital, who will be competing with the private equity firms, but also the infrastructure buyers who are now going to double down on what they see as a resilient social infrastructure. We've got people doing things differently. And I think that's a very good way of summarizing some of these changes. So it's not just digital, it's the use of data, it's the use of doing things remotely, whether it's remote diagnostics, more in the home, probably things like mental health. I know people are delivering mental health services remotely now. And that will unfortunately probably be a growth market coming out of COVID. And then the third point was really just around leverage, that the debt markets are back, the equity markets are back for healthcare. And I think that's a very good introduction to our next speaker. We're delighted to be partnering with Clydesdale and Yorkshire Bank on this. And I think the debt piece is a really important part of the puzzle. And I hope Derek will also share with us the conversations he's having with Credit Committee when he compares healthcare to the other sectors out there, because a lot of these banks are clearly exposed to consumer, retail, leisure and transport. And I think historically healthcare has not always been a straightforward credit position particularly when it's been exposed to, for example, the elderly care sector. And now it's looking, remarkably resilient and dull compared to some of these other sectors. So Derek, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Good morning, thank you, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. Yeah, just a bit of background on myself. Derek Breingan, I'm a career banker. I have been in various organisations over my time and had served in the RBS healthcare team before joining Clydesdale Yorkshire Bank to develop a sector approach really in health and social care, which the bank was looking to put in place. So the team has now grown from myself 6 years ago to 21 within the health social care specialist team, and we've deliberately grown that with a view to expanding our lending into key areas such as private equity, non-sponsored transactions, and 5 of the team are actually from an accountancy background to allow us to do that well. The original legacy book we had was traditionally elderly care homes, which really made up the bulk of our portfolio. So we deliberately took a view to expand that and take our appetite into different areas within health and social care, and much of which has been covered by the gents before in terms of the key areas that we would be drawn to. So also recognising a demand for new assets, we developed a specialist product for development of new care home assets, which is an SPV development finance product. And that was launched fairly successfully and has proved to be a stable part of our business. And we've now created over 4,000 new beds into principally the elderly care market in mainland UK. And we still have a number of sites which, despite COVID, have continued to be productive during the lockdown, and we continue to fund those. So the book has now grown to just over £1 billion, Henry, I'm pleased to say. We have done that based on our leverage model approach from day one. So we tried to steer away from a loan-to-value focus, which was traditionally what had been seen in, I guess, Main Street banking approaches. So we did that, and we've set that stall out pretty early. We kind of followed similar aims to, I guess, private equity and investors, where we're looking at quality management teams. We're looking at the leveraged approach. We do focus on sort of EBITDA, runway EBITDA, a valuation model based on that, and we do look to do transactions based on an adequate return for the risk. And equally, we're looking for growth potential and strong exits as well. So the portfolio based on that has actually proved to be fairly robust during the COVID-19 pandemic, sorry. And we've actually taken straw polls of all our customers at the end of every month to establish where we felt risks were going to pop up. And no surprise, the slides previously highlighted that elderly care is perhaps the one that stands out, where whilst the portfolio has actually remained fairly steady, We have seen some challenges around about fill-up risk on newly commissioned assets. So we're working with customers on those to establish what the best plans are for those. Generally speaking, on CBILs, yes, we've supported the CBIL scheme and the BILL scheme and the KILL-BILL scheme since they were launched. I'd have to say that my experience of those products is that in health and social care there has been little take-up thus far of those. So to put that into context, you know, the organisation, the business banking side, we've lent £600 million worth of government-backed lending into the general portfolio. And in terms of our exposure within that, we've only lent so far just north of 15 million. We do expect some more requests potentially in the next month, I would suggest. However, it just shows that I think there's generally an appetite not to burden care businesses or health and social care businesses with more debt. One of the things we've done is capital repayment holidays, which other lenders have also offered, and I think those have been very well received and have probably sustained a lot of cash in businesses where the main pressures would have been in March, April, May and June. So if you move on to the next slide, Henry, please. So during the last 12 months, I suppose this reflects some of the transactions that we've now been involved in. We now have probably the second largest sector within our business banking portfolio within Clydesdale Yorkshire Bank as part of the Virgin Money UK PLC. And you'll see some of the names on here are quite familiar and have appeared in some of the previous slides as well. I would highlight on this particular slide Field Bay, which is part of the Invivo group. That's a new customer to ourselves, but is backed by Apposite Capital. And we actually completed that transaction during lockdown. TLC Care is another one to highlight here, which is a high-end quality operator in the elderly care space. And we have actually just started funding a new development for them, which is on site currently. So these are two transactions that we've managed to work with our risk colleagues during the lockdown and progress. And the other ones are across a number of the subsectors that we are involved in. Next slide, please, Henry. So I think the slides previously from the other contributors have been excellent, and I pick out Izzy's slide on speed of recovery and also David's slide on economic impact, and some of the points I've raised here that we evidence are probably reflected again here that were in those slides. So I do expect that, according to the valuation firms that we speak to, that multiples will probably remain fairly stable. However, the focus we would have is probably on a bit of understanding around about the FMT expectations on businesses, the fair maintainable trade, future projected trading based on COVID experience and what that might look like as we come out of this period of lockdown, and therefore what that would do in terms of leverage multiples going forward. So there's quite a lot of work going on with that just now, and we're obviously discussing these sort of things with our credit risk colleagues. No change in the importance of very strong management teams. That's proven to be one of the standouts of the portfolio during this crisis, and we've seen fantastic leadership and collaboration across the sector. And I think there'll be continued investment attraction, as the gents have already confirmed, and for us we see that in adult specialist care and supported living, probably complex care in more secure settings. Children's residential care and education, which has been in the press this week, where there's a huge uptake in demand due to the actual lockdown having impacts on family settings, and crisis care on the back of that as well, which then leads to fostering. And again, this week in the news, huge demand of uptake in fostering. And then primary care, where we've got dentistry, pharmacy and post-operative rehab customers. These have been quite resilient already, despite dentistry obviously having a period of lockdown. But also, the future for these businesses is strong because the pent-up demand for treatment is already evident from the ones that opened in the last week. So as they work their way through that, these businesses will come out very resilient, as will the sort of GP side that we fund as well, where the super practices have proven to be a very robust model of providing that type of service and using technology and investing in new ways of delivering GP services. So, we've got a very optimistic view that in the medium to long term, this is a very positive sector for us to continue to lend into. And in fact, our aspiration is to continue to grow the book on the basis of the way we've done it thus far, to develop a strong portfolio as part of our overall business banking proposition. We do have exposure to other sectors, as you mentioned, Henry, and understandably there's obviously some areas which will favour better than others. I would say that in our half-year results that were posted to the market in April, that there is a slide deck on there if anybody's interested that gives a breakdown of the actual portfolio within business banking, and it does clearly state that we've been deliberate in focusing on what were deemed to be more resilient sectors, of which health and social care is a primary one. So our exposure to some of the sectors that you mentioned, Henry, is actually quite minimal, and therefore leaves us in a reasonably strong position. But noting there are some headwinds that we will have to address in the meantime.
Derek, thank you very much, Sam. I think my takeaway from that is that healthcare consistently has proved its resilience, that you're still lending to good credits, you're still supporting new developments where it makes sense. And if you look at that CBIL statistic you had, where you've lent £600 million across all the different government programs to people as a result of the coronavirus support, and only 2.5%, 15 million, has gone into healthcare, which really shows you how the sector has responded well. And I guess the question everybody's really trying to focus on now is where this market goes in the next 6 to 12 months. So on that, we've now got 15 minutes for Q&A, and I'm just going to go back to the active poll, and you can see from that we've had over 100 people actually respond to the poll. Can I just encourage anybody who would like to ask a question just to log in again to Slido, or to upvote any questions that you'd like us to focus on. But nearly half of the audience thinks that deal flow is going to come back in September. And 35% think it's too early to tell. So in some ways, the audience is split 50-50. It's all going to happen in September, or it's going to get pushed into next spring, or perhaps even later. But there is September is leading. So I'm just going to now switch over to the Q&A. And I think at this point, as I said, encourage people to upvote the questions you'd like us to focus on. But the one that's coming out on top at the moment, the leader on the board, is whether we see a divide in valuations for care homes between those who have been affected by COVID and those that haven't. And I think I'll sort of start perhaps with Izzy and David on this, because I think the other question I have is this whole concept of EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, amortization, depreciation, amortization, and COVID. Do we think the market will buy into EBITDA to perhaps see through some of these COVID impacts in the near term and start looking out into the spring or further? So why don't I start with you, Izzy? Do we think there is this divide in valuations, and can we use EBITDA to look through it?
Well, I mean, I think we're talking about elderly care homes here, which I think we are. I think in general, the larger, or indeed the mid-sized elderly care groups, tend to have slightly more modern or sort of longer-term resilient proof real estate. So I think with those operators who have a portfolio and can demonstrate, a long track record, I think those guys, you probably can look at valuation sort of adjusting for COVID. That being said, I think if you're trying to get, a premium valuation for a business which, you believed merits a premium valuation, I think getting some way through the rebound will be important to show that trajectory coming out of COVID. So yes, I think you can, but it will be situation dependent, and as always, it will be business.
And David, I don't know whether you've got some a perspective on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, echoing a little bit what Izzy said, I mean, the larger care groups, larger quality care homes, obviously have had access to PPE probably before some of the smaller homes have. So some of the larger groups have fared better, and therefore their EBITDA has been more sustainable through the COVID period. So I think, particularly where some of these businesses may come back to market, people will look at how they traded through the COVID period, and that will affect valuation. So I think you will see a little bit of a divide, and people will reference COVID and how trading went through COVID. One, just picking up on an earlier point on, return of M&A by September versus later. I think, Izzy, I'm sure, is wrestling with the same challenges. We don't know if there's going to be a second spike, and launching a process and then having a second spike, and then, potential having to slow down a process or stall a process is not a great place to be. So as an advisor, it's a really difficult one to be prepping for September, not knowing where we will be with COVID going forward.
Yeah. I think that's very fair. We don't know when that second spike will come. Equally, I hope that we'll be a bit better prepared this time round. I think that the next question is actually probably one for Derek. What criteria can be used as a benchmark for assessing when a care provider is at risk of insolvency? And just to sort of overlay on that, I think that the banks generally have been very, very good this time round, in contrast perhaps with some of the banks' behaviour, including Derek's former employer during the last crisis, where they have been really good at giving people covenant waivers, payment holidays, and not enforcing any form of security, particularly for care providers, where it would be a PR disaster, frankly. But that doesn't mean that can carry on forever. And I guess the question really is, at what point does it come to the position where, just from a banking perspective, you have to do something? What KPIs, what metrics, what benchmarks are you looking at where when a business might actually be insolvent? And I think, as we've talked about before, particularly in elderly care, where if a provider's been hit by COVID, the new admissions are very slow. Maybe they're exposed with a lot of new developments that aren't filling. And we've heard that normally it would be 18 months. Now people are assuming it'd be 30 months. There is a lot of distress there potentially. How are you dealing with that, Derek?
So I think from early start, we were setting that leverage focus, and therefore a covenant suite that was appropriate for that type of measure. So just a sort of standard, debt to EBITDA multiple, and also then a covenant suite around about debt serviceability, whether that's debt service or CAFAD's cover. I mean, these are fundamental to ongoing assessment of our portfolio. So they should give us early signs of any impact on the debt servicing capability of the business and its ability to trade. I suppose I could probably speak on behalf of other banks, but certainly our position is that we have very clear ways to address anything that does start to look as if it's going slightly adrift. And it's very much about relationship management. It's very much about understanding what the problems are firsthand, and then trying to deliver some form of assistance. Now, whether that is in the form of capital repayment holidays, or whether we start to look at covenant easing, it may be that we have to consider bringing in some additional support, but that would probably be management-led rather than financial-led to address any issues which generally in the care home market tend to be driven by the old stables of occupancy and fill up and commissioning and then operations. We also review the regulators' viewings of how homes are performing, and that's another metric that we follow, again highlighting management capability. So there's a lot of things have to trigger before we get to a position where we believe we've got a situation that's probably irrecoverable and we have to take some formal action. But I think we're much more aware of, as the gents have said before, social infrastructure, value to society, people living in these particular environments and the staffing that goes with it. These are huge contributors to our economy, and equally we have to work with them to continue to support them. So I think the COVID-19 crisis, if anything, would have flushed out some problems by now, which to date we haven't actually seen huge distress or collapse or failure. And a lot of the issues that we see and discuss on this call have probably been issues in the sector before COVID ever came over the hill, in terms of funding and government's white papers, green papers, etc. So a lot of what we're talking about here is just a different nuance to what we talked about before.
And just one supplementary question, Derek, just loan to value. It's quite difficult to value these properties or update the valuation of them during a lockdown. But how is the bank looking at LTV valuations when it looks at leverage, given the uncertainty of what that value is?
Well, we have to use. I mean, we've got a large enough portfolio now. We can actually assess our own view on value, because we've got evidence across the portfolio of how values have been, and we also can evidence that through the market. The valuations that we have stand for 3 years. We've got the ability to go in and look at those in terms of the fair maintainable trade assessment, which is the key here as to what they believe that business can contribute, and therefore how does it perform against that. Gives us a good flavour of whether it's trading at that full value or not. So I suppose there's a bit of science in it, which is where a specialist team comes in to its own, because we can make a lot of these assessments ourselves. And actually, the inability to value at the moment hasn't really caused us huge concerns, because it's really about the cash flow at the end of the day and the sustainability of that operation, and the value is a factor of that. So that's really how we've just kind of addressed it internally, I suppose.
Okay. I've just got a question now for the investors, so for Sam and Ben. And we've heard an awful lot about how the market is changing. It's all about digital health and telemedicine and technology solutions. I think one of the challenges I always have is that sounds great, but it's actually quite difficult to deploy equity into those sectors and to find an asset or a platform that's big enough. And I would just be interested to hear your perspectives on whether you are seeing enough deal flow that fits the new changes that we're seeing in supply and demand and the segments that we would like to be in. Whereas, if you look historically, clearly most of the capital has been deployed in more traditional segments, sort of the sort of assets maybe Warren Buffett might have invested in. So the first question is, are you seeing that deal flow in the sectors you'd like to be in coming out of COVID, with the lessons of COVID? And then I guess the second one is sort of linked to that, which is just, if you look at where valuations are, and everything I'm hearing today is that valuations aren't going down anytime soon. If anything, the supply demand in terms of the capital around chasing healthcare has got worse, which is what Ben was saying. And then if you look at the debt side, we've had base rates cut, and we're hearing that leverage multiples are holding up. So put all that together, you've got value expectations on the part of sellers, you've got plenty of equity, you've got cheap debt, and you've got leverage, and you're trying to find assets that fit into the new world. That's quite a challenging mix from where I'm sitting. But maybe you're seeing opportunities out there, and you are seeing deal flow. Shall I start with you, Ben, on that? There's quite a lot of questions in there. Just need to unmute yourself. Yep.
Done. I'll start with the digital health and the telemedicine. I mean, so we invest in businesses probably at the bottom end that are making £2 million of profits, and we have not seen many of them that are. I also suspect that some of the more nimble traditional service providers will develop offers such as these of their own. I know Medivet, for example, has got a teleconsultation offer now. Kind of had to, basically, during lockdown. And so we are not at Inflexion seeing a lot of what you might call remote consultation type digital health assets, nor telehealth or remote monitoring technologies. That doesn't mean we're not seeing a lot of technology businesses, but they tend to be more around business management systems and that kind of thing, rather than anything that you would say was directly COVID related. I suppose as well, what struck me about the statistic that Izzy quoted earlier in the webinar was kind of how do you value a business which has seen that kind of uptick, and it's a kind of what do you think the kind of non-lockdown EBITDA of that company is? It's a challenge. But as I say, we're not seeing a huge amount of them anyway. I mean, on the valuation side, I personally, I think valuations were already pretty high anyway. We've been in a market where businesses regularly command kind of mid-teens multiples, and so we've already had to kind of coexist with that issue. As you all know from your days at Jefferies and UBS, it only takes two to create an auction. So even if there are only two investors, you can have to pay a high price. And what we've always had to do at Inflexion is just pick entrepreneurial management teams and businesses that can deliver the growth that justifies those multiples. I worry that there will be a lot of people coming in who are relatively new to the sector who bid up the prices, and they may well do that for businesses that don't necessarily warrant those multiples. And I think it's just incumbent on us to continue to originate transactions, continue to build our network to make sure that we can pick the ones that do justify those high multiples, and to make sure that we can avoid the ones that don't, basically.
Sam, just to wrap up, and we've got 30 seconds left, it sounds like valuations are staying high. There's maybe some silly money out there, but there are opportunities. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I think that the model that we have at Apposite is probably favoured by high valuations, because what we're trying to do is create best-in-class market leaders that will be highly valued at exit. Obviously, we start with smaller businesses that are perhaps imperfectly formed or need growth in certain areas to become those market leaders. And there, I think there may be some more advantageous valuations, and certainly the opportunity to grow from those smaller beginnings very rapidly creates an opportunity for Sodexo. Henry, you're on mute.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Sam. Just to wrap up there, so we stick to time, just to say thank you very much to our partners, and particularly to Clydesdale and Yorkshire for sponsoring this, to the media partners, Care Markets and Healthcare Markets, and the two charities we've been supporting throughout the pandemic. Thank you very much to our panelists. There's been a fantastic range of views there, and I think some good themes coming out of it. The webinar will be available on demand on the website. The slides will be downloadable, and that'll be around later this afternoon. And then just to wrap up and say our next webinar is just focused around how COVID is reshaping the markets. And we've got a number of providers across specialist care, children's services, the hospital market, private pay market, and some of the leading consultants. And Professor Martin Green, who's been giving evidence to Jeremy Hunt at the Health Select Committee, which has been quite interesting actually. If you haven't watched it, we've got people from Germany and Japan giving evidence as well, so comparing the UK's response to other nations. But it just remains to say thank you all very much indeed for attending, and we will see you on the next webinar.